Welcome back, and I apologize in advance because I'm just getting over a cold, so my voice is even more nasally than usual. Um, Alright, so first a quick recap. Chapter 7 and 8 discuss the effects of different systems, polarities, using economics as a parallel, showing economic systems in Chapter 7, and then delving into the military effects in Chapter 8. And Waltz also made a strong argument that smaller is better than small, and in Chapter 8 that bipolarity is better for stability and war and peace than multipolarity. You'll notice that he doesn't mention unipolarity, and even says that 2 is the smallest number possible. I don't know why that is. I'm not sure why he thought that. I think it was a lack of foresight on his part. I would mention that I don't see anything within his theory of international politics that would make unipolarity impossible. I think he just didn't really see it coming in that way, although he did say that he saw the collapse of the Soviet Union coming, because the Soviet Union wasn't keeping up, and that was clear even in the 70s already. And he does rank the Soviet Union as the weaker of the two powers even when he writes this. So I'm not sure why he didn't see it, but he very quickly shifted, and he does accept that the world was unipolar. And as of 2003, he insisted that the world still was unipolar, and I think he would agree with me that it's still unipolar today in 2015. We're going to talk today about international cooperation and dissent, how different polarities affect the management of international affairs. At the end of Chapter 8, you may remember that he talks about how power doesn't reliably bring control. Talks about how we shouldn't expect that control within a territory can be won militarily, even if control of a territory can be. So if it doesn't bring control, what does it do? 4 things, he says. The first 2 we've already spoken about, which is provides a means for keeping autonomy in the face of force wielded by others, and it permits a wider range of action. What it also does is that the powerful enjoy wider margins of safety when dealing with the less powerful, and they have more to say about the rules of the game. That's one big thing. And he uses the economic example here of Chrysler, the car company. Back then, the big 3, there was Ford, GM, Chrysler, and Chrysler had to make the right decisions, because if it made the wrong ones, it would go bankrupt. It had a smaller margin, whereas GM could have losses for years, which indeed it did. Now we know eventually GM went bankrupt, but that's not the point. It was able to run big losses. A big company could lose money for a long time without a problem. And that means it has a wider margin of safety. The fourth point he mentions is that great power gives its possessors a big stake in their system and the ability to act for its sake. So they're free to worry more, should be more about, absolute gains than relative ones. And I'll get on to relative versus absolute gains in the next slide. Now this slide is not actually from the book, but I wanted to take a moment to make clear what he's talking about here. He's mentioned relative and absolute gains before, so this scenario illustrates them. Suppose you and another person are going to get money, but only you get to choose how much both of you get, but you only have a choice between option A and option B. In option A, you get 10 pounds or dollars or euros or yen or whatever. Well, 10 yen's not very much money, but you get 10 and the other person gets 10. Okay, option B, you get 20, and the other person gets 50. Now the economist would say, take B, obviously, because you get twice as much money. An economist would say to worry more about the absolute gains. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Obviously, that's what you should do. Option B, you will get twice as much money as option A, so what's the problem? But studies have shown that many people would choose option A because they think about fairness rather than about the absolute gain, even though both of you would be better off with B. Everyone would be better off if you chose B. So in the economic realm, we would try to get more absolute gains. But in the political realm, where we worry about things being zero-sum, your security is my insecurity, and vice versa. So a nervous politician, foreign policy advisor, military advisor would say, why should they get 2.5 times as much as us? Let's take A. It's fairer. And what he's talking about with countries having a larger margin, they can worry more about absolute gains. So let's say you and your nearest competitor have a similar military strength. You would definitely take option A. If there was some theoretical option where you would get a 20% boost in military power, but they would get 50%, that would be really bad. They would have more military power than you. and their security would be your insecurity. You would have reason to worry. So you would rather that you both just get a 10% increase in military power. Now, if you're in a situation in the world where your nearest competitor is way, way behind you, or after the second superpower, everybody else is way behind, you don't care if people get a big boost to their military because they still are no threat to you whatsoever. Then you can worry about absolute gains more. And this is what you saw with the United States wanting Europe to spend more on military. Normally, you don't want other countries to spend more on their militaries because they could compete with you. The United States wasn't worried about that. It saw European parties being able to increase their power and maybe reduce the amount that the United States would have to do, making everybody better off, potentially. But making the United States in that situation more better off, even though that's grammatically incorrect, than everybody else. So if you have a margin of power, you can take option B without worrying that the others are getting more than you are. If you don't have a margin of power, you take option A, even though everyone, including you, is worse off. Now, in section 1, he talks about the fact that people assume that war and the risk of war are worse than the alternative, which would be constructing and sustaining a system of management. Now, in the last chapter, he talked about the costs of, or the virtues of anarchy and the costs of hierarchy, that it would be an invitation to a global civil war if you had global power, and the amount of power you would need at the center to offset the power of the most powerful states within the system would be massive. Would cause scapegoating, would cause resistance. So it wouldn't be as easy or even as desirable as some people sometimes say to have world government. Whether it would be desirable overall or not is another question, but he's saying not only is it not possible or not conceivable at the current time to construct world government, but we may not even want it that much. But here he decides to talk instead a little bit about why collective action for the common good is so hard in an anarchic realm. And the first example is externalities. He doesn't use that term, but that's the economic term. And one of the biggest externalities that you see is pollution. And it's called an externality because a company can externalize the cost, meaning it can push the cost for something onto others rather than paying it itself. So if you have factories dumping pollution into a river, they dump their waste into the river. They could pay to dispose of it properly, but that would be expensive. It's much cheaper just to dump it in the river. And then who pays for it? Fishermen, bathers, people who need the drinking water all downstream. They all pay a very high price for that company's waste disposal. Now, if one single company started paying to dispose of its waste properly, that company would have much higher costs than the others. Its goods would be more expensive. People wouldn't buy those goods, and that company would go out of business, meaning the only remaining companies would be companies that dump their pollution in the river. This is a sort of collective action problem that's common in the world, and it's why we see problems with overfishing, problems with world pollution. Well, actually, fisheries are public goods, which is the next one, or I think he calls them collective goods. Goods or services with positive externalities, if you think about it. So a negative externality means the costs are externalized, so all the costs aren't carried by the person who makes the good. With public goods, it's the other way around. The person who provides the good pays all the costs, but doesn't get all the benefits. Many other people get the benefits instead as well. And things like that are public parks, I would say fisheries, shared fisheries, fire services. Even if it's not your house that burns down, if they prevent the house next door from burning down, that could save you as well. So you benefit even though you don't pay for it, for example. Now, if in a world without government, you would have the problem of who should pay for these things. The public goods, everybody would hang back on paying for them and hope that others would cover the cost because you would free ride. You would get to enjoy the benefits without having to pay for it. And with the pollution example, as you saw, none of the factories would be willing on their own to clean up the pollution because any factory that did that would have really high costs and would go out of business. So it makes getting together and organizing for the common good really, really difficult, even if you have the best intentions. So without regulation, you'll have too many of the externalities like pollution and too few public goods. And security is one of those public goods. And so in the world in general, you would expect security to be undersupplied. And you would expect overpollution or pollution to be oversupplied, for example. You would also expect overfishing to be very common and all those other sorts of things that would require collective action. So if no world government means coercing a reduction in pollution and things like that, and forcing people to pay for public goods is difficult, and less gets done internationally than domestically, assuming you have a relatively well-functioning domestic government. But he says how much gets done depends on the number of great powers. Everybody's business is nobody's business. As the examples showed, for example, if you had 2 factories polluting a river, they might be able to get together and come to an agreement not to pollute the river, because it's a greater good. If there are 100 factories all along the river, it'd be much more difficult for them to agree, right? So, and as he's shown, smaller numbers means easier cooperation. So when it's not everybody's business, it's the business of just a few, great powers have the capacity to handle the problems and set rules and worry less about relative gains, so they can take on some of the management of international affairs. This means also, if you had just a few really big factories and then a lot of much smaller ones, the big factories could get together and decide not to pollute, even if the small ones continued to pollute, and everyone would benefit externally, and those factories that did that would be able to benefit from that change as well, even though the little factories around them would benefit even more by being able to undercut them in price. And there's another example of this on the bottom of page 197. He says, suppose a few drought-stricken farmers are able to make rain by hiring someone to seed clouds. They will alleviate drought for themselves and also for neighboring farmers who may refuse to pay their share of the costs and still benefit either way. Rainmaking is a collective good. The few farmers having the largest spreads may decide to provide it. Because the number of parties is small, they can hope to reach agreement, and they are spurred on by the size of their stakes and the urgency of their need. So the larger the group, the less it will further its common interests. Conversely, the smaller group and the less equal the interests of its members, the likelier it becomes that some members, the larger ones, will act for the group's interest as they define it and not just for their own. The greater the relative size of a unit, the more it identifies its own interest with the interests of the system. So again, here you have a few big farmers, and they'll pool their resources together. A couple of them will decide to make it rain. That will benefit the small farmers as well, even if the small farmers don't pay for it. But the big farmers can say, okay, well, we can cover the costs ourselves. We're big. There are 3 of us. We have more money than the smaller farmers, perhaps more money than the smaller farmers combined. And if we don't make it rain, we could go bust. So let's just do it. We'll pay for it, and we'll forget about the fact that the others are benefiting without paying for it. We'll let the others free ride. That essentially is what you can see in the international realm as well. Great powers getting together, deciding to cooperate on these things, even though other countries may free ride on their decisions. Everyone is better off. The countries that free ride are even better off than the countries that are paying for it, but the countries that are paying for it are better off too. I hope that makes sense. I know this is a little bit confusing. If you need help on this, you can look up the free rider problem, in economics, or you can look at things like collective goods or public goods and things like externalities in economics terms. You can Google those, and they'll have other explanations and examples for you to look at. Great powers may try to transform the system by destroying or weakening other great powers, or encouraging smaller powers to amalgamate or become stronger. And the US has gone both ways. So initially, US goals were to halt communism and hopefully to try to diminish and bring down the Soviet Union, which would have led to US hegemony and unipolarity, which eventually happened anyway, after Waltz's writing. The US also tried to encourage European integration in order for a European power to emerge that it thought would help it manage world affairs. Because great powers have a large stake in the system, they come to equate their own interests with concern for the system. We saw it with the farmers. The big farmers were acting in their own interests and seeding the clouds, but that was also in the interest of everyone else. And great powers will do that, and they will often claim to be acting in the interests of everyone. Whether everyone agrees with the great powers' definition of what everyone's interest is another question, though, and a source of potential tension, of course. American leaders express soaring aims like putting an end to conflict by creating an American-European Union, united by values of democracy and human rights and things like that. This level of rhetoric was completely unprecedented, but then again, so was American power. though that goal was still over the top despite the level of American power. I think we can agree. Now, with regard to that American-European Union, he notes that the extension of American power and influence into Europe would lead to pressure for Europe to reassert its autonomy. And I spelled autonomy wrong. And he postulates that this would be a force that would drive European unification, in addition to the superpower competition playing out on its soil. So in addition to the fact that the European powers are no longer pushed apart by the fact that all of the great powers are within Europe and they're competing with each other, and in addition to the fact that Europe is surrounded on both sides by superpowers, which would give cause for concern and could encourage unification, he also states that the extension of US influence in Western Europe would make Europeans want to gain more power so that they can gain more independence from the United States, which you also see. And he points out Charles de Gaulle was always one that pushed for that sort of thing, and you see varying degrees of that within Europe. And many people have said that the European Union was brought about and defines Europeanness largely in opposition to Americanness. So I think European unification also was driven on by that American power. Yeah, and he also mentions possession of great power tempts its wielder to use it, at times foolishly. And he's thinking here about Vietnam, which was not too long ago when he wrote this, but Iraq also comes to mind. And here he talks about what would happen if Europe became a third great power. And I put that in the past because this was in 1979. He mentions that for reasons of tradition, of political compatibility, and of ideological preference, a new Europe might well pull westward. But we know that the internal characteristics and the preferences of nations do not provide sufficient grounds for predicting behavior. Right? All of it, the theory of international politics, this entire book, is about how the ideological preferences of the leaders and the people in a country are not enough to predict how the country will act. There are systemic forces. And here they are. The USSR and the newly united Europe would be the weaker of the three great powers and would thus be inclined to balance the US. Now, being closer by, I would mention that the USSR might still pose a larger threat to Europe in that case. So it's not only about absolute power, but also who's the bigger threat to you. So it probably would stay closer to the US than the USSR, but, as he says, and this is probably true, not in one grand confrontation, but on many issues of importance, the Soviet Union and the new Europe would cooperate in ways that we would find unpleasant. And to an extent, we see that already. The US and Europe do not always agree, and you have countries like Germany that are much more sympathetic to Russia than other countries within the EU, and certainly than the United States. So you might see that shift towards a powerful Europe no longer fearing the Soviet Union so much, no longer needing the United States security guarantees to protect it. It would begin going its own way more and would shift a bit away from the United States and might cooperate with the Soviet Union in ways the United States didn't like. So he says American wishes at the time for the European Union to become a great power, thinking it would balance the Soviet Union, he thinks these are a bit misplaced. We'd be better off being bipolar. Not only would the United States be better off if the world remained bipolar, but he gives reason to believe that the entire world would be better off bipolar than tripolar, because as we discussed in a previous chapter, tripolarity is often believed to be the least stable. So the question becomes whether the stalemate-inducing unit-level effect of second-strike nuclear capabilities would be enough to overcome the system-level instability wrought by tripolarity. So what that means is that if you accept that tripolarity is less stable, because two powers could always come together to eliminate a third power, and then they would have a system of bipolarity, which would be stable and would be fine for both of them, so they'd have no reason to fear it. So you would see tripolarity breaking down, either becoming multipolarity or becoming bipolarity. Not an ideal situation. But he notes that second-strike nuclear capabilities, the fact that neither the US or the USSR could be sure that it could eliminate the other's nuclear weapons in a first strike, meaning that if either attacked the other could attack back, and they could totally destroy each other. This brought caution. This led to a nuclear stalemate. This meant that neither the US or the USSR could really progress or force their way or get their way in things against each other. And the question is if this stalemate-inducing effect of nuclear weapons would be enough to overcome the instability that's brought on by tripolarity. So it's not that tripolarity would now be different, but there's a unit level effect that has a really big effect pushing for stalemate that might overcome it. But he notes this is more complicated, which means there's greater uncertainty. And greater uncertainty means greater difficulty in maintaining the stalemate, which means we should prefer bipolarity. Things that would be more stable, would be safer, you'd be less likely to have nuclear war. And he says that because of that, by the 1970s, America sought to maintain the system rather than change it. And this marked the maturation of the bipolar system. Both sides now saw that maintaining the system rather than challenging it and each other was the most sensible. There was a peaceful status quo, things were okay, leave them as they are, work to maintain the balance, work to maintain the system as it is, not change it. Oh, and I just want to mention that acceptance of the system as it was known as détente. That was Henry Kissinger's policy, to try to manage bipolarity and not try to change the course of things or reorder the world, but accept it the way that it was and calm things down, calm tensions down. All right, so the great powers will maintain the system, but will they also help others and provide general services? And he notes here, which has been more difficult, to moderate and control Russian behavior in Berlin and Cuba, or within the US to get persons of different color to accept each other? So even the most powerful can't control and influence everything to their own satisfaction. It's thus easy but wrong to conclude that control over international affairs is inordinately difficult to contrive. It depends on the type of control you're talking about, and it varies from system to system. So he's saying if you have realistic expectations about the sort of control, it's possible, and the level of control that you have varies from system to system, and as you might have guessed, he thinks that you can have the greatest control with bipolarity, or at least with lower numbers rather than higher numbers within the system. Now, great powers fight to maintain the balance of power due to their own interests, but this is also a public good that should be appreciated by smaller powers that don't wish to be conquered. The amalgamation of power is dangerous, so maintaining a balance of power between the great powers is a good thing even for those who don't participate in it. But it's not always a good thing. He notes that great powers balanced against Germany, so you shouldn't see Germany as the subject here, but Germany was balanced against by maintaining the independence of its weaker neighbors. So the other powers saw the independence of other countries around Germany as key to balancing Germany's power and maintaining a buffer between them. At the same time, Prussia, Russia, and Austria decided to balance each other's interests by carving up Poland. So the balance of power did not turn out so well for Poland in that case. And this is no surprise. In whatever realm, managers are often unpopular, whether it's in a business or in the international world. They have the power and they make these decisions, and others have to go along with it. They're not always what everybody would like. But he notes we should expect, and we have experienced, more managerial effort in a bipolar world than is usually seen in a multipolar one, because it's easier to do managing with just two great powers rather than several. On a similar note, more management is not always good. So we may rail against, the self-interest of countries that are only looking after their own interests and their own security and not paying attention to world affairs. But actually, we may fear the arrogance of global burden bearers more than the selfishness of those who tend only to their narrow interests. Because close competition subordinates ideology to interest. If two great powers are close to each other in military power terms, they don't have time to worry about ideology. They need to worry about interest. They need to worry about stability. They need to worry about security. They can't be thinking about promoting freedom or promoting communism or promoting Islam or whatever it is, right? They have to subordinate ideology to interest. But states that enjoy a margin of power, or a large margin of power, over their closest competitors, for them, interests become not so important and ideology can rise to the forefront again, right? Because they don't have to worry about their security narrowly defined, and they begin to define security more broadly. So they are led to pay undue attention to minor dangers and to pursue fancies abroad that reach beyond the fulfillment of interests narrowly defined in terms of security. Does that sound like the United States in 2003 to anyone else? Right? This is exactly what he's talking about. And Waltz, when unipolarity dawned, he was very worried. He was very worried about unipolarity. He didn't like the idea of unbalanced power, and he warned and warned that the US would be likely to overextend itself and to make excessive use of its power and to stir up trouble abroad. And people thought, oh, that's ridiculous. And then the Iraq War happened, and now he seems prescient, and that's why I call him the high priest of international relations. Because he saw it. He saw it coming. He didn't see unipolarity coming, to be fair. We have to admit that. He didn't see that. Once unipolarity had come, however, he was quite worried about it. He didn't think it was necessarily such a good thing. He doesn't believe in hegemonic stability theory. Now, we shouldn't make the opposite mistake and overestimate the bad that comes of it and speak only ill of the US. As he says, we can't hope that the powerful will always get it right, but we can hope that they often will. And what he was talking about with minor dangers and fancies abroad and getting too involved was the Vietnam War. This was in 1979 that he wrote this. And he says American failures in Southeast Asia should not obscure the useful role the United States has played and continues to play in Northeast Asia, in Europe, the Middle East, and in other places. So Northeast Asia in preventing a further conflict between North and South Korea, in making states feel comfortable with the Japanese, and making the Japanese feel comfortable enough not to build up a military because their security is guaranteed by the United States. In Europe throughout the Cold War, making European states feel safe from Soviet aggression. In the Middle East, trying to balance different... Today, arguably, many have argued, we're seeing the consequences of U.S. relative withdrawal from the Middle East. U.S. still has bases there and things. You couldn't say it's withdrawn, but it left a power vacuum, particularly in Iraq, and we saw the rise of Islamic State as a result. And a lack of U.S. involvement there has allowed that to happen. It's also led Saudi Arabia to question the U.S.'s commitment to maintaining stability in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia also questions the U.S.'s commitment to the alliance with Saudi Arabia. So it's getting more active. We're seeing the Saudis more active in foreign policy, carrying out military strikes in Yemen and things like that, than they traditionally have tended to be. Saudi Arabia has tended not to take the lead. It's starting to do that now because it sees the need to counter Iran, which is taking advantage of the vacuum created by the U.S., taking advantage of Saddam Hussein being taken out by the U.S. The Saudis see that as a threat. The Saudis don't see the U.S. there to protect them, so the Saudis are taking it on themselves. And what we're seeing is this turning into a sectarian conflict. These are the sorts of benefits that the U.S. used to provide in security. As Henry Kissinger put it, he was talking about the idea that we can't be the world's policeman, the U.S., and he says, well, that's true, but we need to qualify that. And he says the fact of the matter is that security and progress in most parts of the world depend on some American commitment. The U.S. carries out this world policeman role pretty much to the satisfaction of many others at much more expense to itself than to them. So as you may note, the amount of money European powers spend on security and military compared to what the U.S. spends on security and military, even relative to GDP, whereas the U.S. has troops and security operations stationed in Europe helping to protect Europe at U.S. expense. But it's good for the U.S., but Europe benefits from it too. And this is why the U.S. is more often asked by world leaders to come than to go nowadays. Japan is worried about the U.S.'s commitment to Japan, which is why it's starting to talk tough and starting to think about how it might ensure its own security if the U.S. isn't there. And the thing I mentioned with Saudi Arabia. So you see countries throughout the world, leaders throughout the world, at least quietly, sometimes only privately, asking the U.S. to step up involvement to increase stability and security in their regions. And here we have an opportunity to compare bipolarity and multipolarity, thinking about World War I. How might World War I have been, or the lead up to it, would it have happened in a bipolar world? Could a crisis in Eastern Europe, transport yourself back to the 1970s now, it's still Cold War, still bipolar, or for that matter among any of the US's allies and one of the USSR's, lead to war? And here we're talking about great power war, we're talking about a big war. And we've seen examples of this between Israel and the Arab states, I would argue. Bipolarity clarified the spheres of influence and thus responsibility for them. If there's something happened in Eastern Europe, the US said that's the Soviets' responsibility, we're not going to get involved. because the Soviets wouldn't like it, and there could be an escalation, and they're holding West Berlin hostage. We've got nuclear weapons. Yeah, that's what happened with the Hungarian uprising, as he mentioned. The U.S. didn't get involved because it couldn't. That was in the Soviet sphere. We said, fine, you leave us our spheres, we'll leave yours. No superpower ally, and this is me adding to this, can with wisdom go to war without the backing of its superpower, because it would be foolish to do so. And because the outcome would make little difference to the balance of power, the tail cannot wag the dog. So if a weak ally of the United States goes to war without U.S. approval, it wouldn't necessarily drag the United States into war. The U.S. wouldn't be willing to start a potential nuclear war with the Soviet Union over the actions of one of its smaller allies, even if the ally lost. But it would intervene, perhaps, to help protect the ally. It would talk to the Soviets about not creating a war and maybe calming things down, and that's what we saw in multiple crises in the Middle East. The two superpowers moderated their allies and kept them from dragging them into conflict. The tail couldn't wag the dog, as they say. Now, in World War I, we saw the Balkans, the conflict in the Balkans within Serbia. We saw Austria, the smaller power in the alliance with Germany, dragging Germany into war. That's not really possible with bipolarity, because the superpower has no need to go to war. Even if Israel, for example, had lost the war in 1973 and the U.S. hadn't stepped in, the loss of Israel wouldn't have meant a massive change in the system or a massive loss of power for the United States. That's why the U.S. didn't get involved with Georgia. Even if Georgia were carved up, does the U.S. really care? Yes, on a personal level, for the people of Georgia, for democracy, etc. Does it affect U.S. security? No. And that's why we see those types of effects. It makes things much clearer. And you should consider the lessons for this if the rise of China means there's a new bipolarity coming. It may be easier to manage such crises with bipolarity. Yeah. So it's not necessarily all bad. The rise of China wouldn't necessarily mean World War III, but it could mean a new type of Cold War. In conclusion, it can be said that as the number of great powers decreases and their stakes in the system thus increase, their incentives for international management will increase as well. International cooperation, including on peripheral matters like poverty, population, pollution, and proliferation, becomes easier. Now, to say it's easier does not mean that it's easy, but the point was to discuss differences we can expect between systems, not to say how better cooperation can be achieved. And I hope that he has shown that, well, I feel he has shown that cooperation within a bipolar system is much easier than cooperation when you have multiple great powers. And something we can think about is what that means for unipolarity, because part of what encourages cooperation in a bipolar system is not just the power of the two poles, but the fact that there are two poles. Don't forget that Western Europe had a common enemy with the United States and the Soviet Union. They both feared the Soviet Union and Soviet influence, and that pushed them together. In many ways, unipolarity has meant that much of the world is shifting away from the United States initially out of fear of it. And I think you saw also a further drive to European unification to try to balance American power, even as European defense spending fell because there wasn't such a fear of Soviet power. Now, I think as the world shifts, it's still unipolar, but we're shifting towards something else. Multipolarity, bipolarity. We're seeing translated on regional level. We see regional powers. Countries that are afraid of the regional power more than the United States will ask the United States for help. So I think we will see shifting more towards the United States again as time goes on. And I think we see that particularly in East Asia. And that's the reason for Barack Obama's shift towards Asia, the alleged rebalancing towards Asia. But we see that we can't get out of the Middle East yet either. And that's the end. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks a lot for reading the entire book. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it has been enlightening, and I hope that it will give you lots of things to think about. Any situation, almost any situation in international politics you can think of, can be analyzed using this model that he has put forth here, using the theory of international politics, and it can give you insights. As he points out, you can't explain everything with it, but it will give you a really good starting point to start thinking about, how might things change if China rises? How might things change if the US pulls out of a certain region or increases its involvement? How might things change if, yeah. And I hope that it has sort of whetted your appetite for that, and I hope it has spurred all of you on to think in more detail about systemic effects and international politics in general. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'm thinking about setting up a live YouTube session to talk with people about the consequences of all this and the future of the world using structural realism as a means of analysis. So get in touch. I'll be away for a couple of weeks, but in maybe 3 weeks' time, there could be a YouTube joint session. I'll post that on the Facebook page for this YouTube series, and hopefully we can have a nice interactive seminar about that to talk about the future instead of only theory and the 1970s. See you soon.